I had to sit down with my team and tell them, listen, Care New England invested in this technology. We have an online requisitioning system. Your users are going to utilize that system. And if they don't, then they're not going to get their orders. And if you process another paper order, I'm going to fire you. And it literally had to come to that point for people to push back enough. And it was really challenging.
Without supplies, there's no surgery. Without products, there's no patient care. Welcome to Power Supply, the healthcare supply chain podcast focused on helping you navigate the intricacies of logistics, purchasing, contracting, and supplier relationships. Each episode, we speak with healthcare executives, supply chain leaders, and innovative entrepreneurs from across the country as they share their stories, experience, and expertise on the industry we love. From the loading dock to strategic sourcing, from buyers to the C-suite, and across the enterprise, we tackle the real-life issues impacting the healthcare supply chain. Whether you're tuning in for conversation or inspiration, we're glad you're here. You're just in time to hear it from the source and stock up on insight. So sit back and plug into Power Supply.
On this episode of Power Supply, we will be speaking with Steve Silva, supply chain expert and consultant. And we're talking about the big projects today, Hayes. He's got systems integration and implementation experience. He's got it both within healthcare, but outside of the industry. We're going to kind of compare and contrast his experience working at Hasbro with his healthcare experience today and talk about some of the pitfalls, best practices, and how to see those red flags before they come.
He's definitely going to share all that with us. And we got to talk about toys to the front, which is fun. Gary, you'll love that part. But I hope you will stay around and enjoy the whole episode. Stay with us. All right,
we'll be right back. Steve Silva, supply chain expert and consultant, up next.
Bam! I'm Hayes Walder.
This is Gary Skinner.
And I'm Justin Poulin.
From the studios of Healthcare HQ, you're listening to Power Supply.
Joining us now is Steve Silva, supply chain expert and consultant. We're going to be talking about systems integrations and implementations. Steve, you've got an interesting background and a lot of experience in this area. And so I want to welcome you to the Power Supply podcast. Thanks for coming on the show today.
I'm excited to be here, Justin. Thanks for the opportunity to speak with you.
All right, wait, I'm just going to jump right in, Steve.
Oh, hey,
I'm just going to jump right in. I'm not even going to wait for my turn.
I was like halfway, like my sentence was coming right out. And okay, go ahead.
But I learned what he did prior to healthcare. And please share us a little bit about that. And I think it's fascinating.
Sure. So before I worked in healthcare, I spent about 24 years with Hasbro Toys, working in consumer goods, and really was very interesting and very different from what healthcare was when I made my move over. I started out in, at the time, what was called the traffic department. We didn't even have logistics at Hasbro at that time. And, no one even ever imagined things such as supply chain. So over the years, I worked my way up through the organization, eventually became Senior VP of Global Logistics, and I oversaw container movements, freight movement, warehousing around the world for Hasbro.
Fascinating. It's a shame that Gary's not here because he loves to play with toys, and this would have been, he would have had a lot of really good questions for
Well, let me tell you something about working for a toy company. And, everybody used to say, oh, you work for Hasbro, you work for a toy company. That's going to be really fun. My answer to them would be, I'm going to bring you into the warehouse and I'm going to walk you around the warehouse and you're going to take a look and you're going to tell me what you see. And what they're going to see are brown boxes. And it really doesn't matter what's in those brown boxes. So trust me, working logistics at a toy company was not any fun.
I can imagine.
Especially with the seasonality of the business and the highly promotional nature of the business.
Go ahead, Hayes.
Oh, no, I'm good. I'm going. I thought you were just going to jump all over me. So go ahead.
I was just going to have Steve talk a little bit about what it was like to move to healthcare.
Well, that was where I was going to.
I figured you and I were on the same page.
Sure. It was the move from, for-profit public consumer goods company into a not-for-profit healthcare organization was kind of a culture shock. The largest shock, or the largest change for me, was at Hasbro. I was used to dealing on a global basis. And I went to Care New England, and that was not only not global, it was not national, it was not regional, it was local. So everything that I was doing was now on a local basis, and it was completely opposite of what I was used to. The other thing that was really different for me was coming from, again, the public company, having gone through Sarbanes-Oxley and all the fallout after Enron and all of that good stuff. We had every policy, every procedure, everything documented to a T. And I'll never forget, I asked the first person at Care New England for a particular policy. I said, "You've got to have policies for these, don't you?" And the answer was, "Oh, no, we're not a public company. We don't have to do that." And it was a completely different environment.
Were there some frustrations as well, Steve? Like you walk in, not only other than policies and those things, but like, well, why don't we do this? And they're like, no, it doesn't work this way.
You hit the nail on the head. First of all, there was no such thing as supply chain at Care New England either. And that was many, many years after, I started at Hasbro. They had a purchasing department who was essentially processing transactions at the time. When you asked anybody, why are we doing something this way? The answer was always because that's how we always did it. The other thing that was a real challenge, and I can't forget this when moving to healthcare, the customer-vendor relationship is completely opposite than it is in almost any other industry. So I came from consumer goods, and the Walmarts and Targets of the world were our largest customers, and they carried the stick. They had the power. So in my world, it was always the customer has the power. The customer is always right. Well, you go to healthcare, the healthcare institutions, for the most part, are not larger than the vendors. And the vendors have the power in the marketplace more so than the healthcare institution does. And that was a real paradigm change. And that was a huge adjustment to try to work through.
That's a really interesting point. I don't know if I've ever heard anybody say it that way. You are, even though you are the end user and or the customer, you don't have that big stick that you would if you're the Walmarts and those or Hasbro or whatever. So that's interesting. Yeah, I like that. That was interesting.
Yeah, I think we've all been kind of aware of that paradigm. But the causality behind it, Steve, I think I've never heard quite like, oh, yeah, they're the smaller entity in that relationship. I don't think I ever, it makes sense when you look at it. It makes perfect sense. But you're right. It's an interesting paradigm shift. And I kind of wonder, with that, how did your role change when you went to healthcare? And what were some keys that, some things that maybe you did right away that were able to help you succeed and navigate through that?
Well, it was really had to just change my whole approach and my whole thought process, because where I was used to a large customer coming in and saying, we're going to give you orders on Tuesday morning, you're going to fill them by Tuesday afternoon, and then we're going to have them delivered by Wednesday, Thursday. I couldn't, as the customer now, say that to my vendors. I had to work with my vendors and understand what their processes were. And I had to, and especially in an organization that was not very process driven. So to understand how our business would fit into their processes, I not only had to understand what they required, but then we had to build those processes within our organization.
Did you also have to find people within the organization to help you build them? How hard was that?
Yeah. Well, timing was such that at the time I joined Care New England, they were in the midst of their first ERP implementation, and that was in 2014. And that was an opportunity to build processes coming out of that implementation or going through that implementation. And it was really in a world where a lot of process just didn't exist.
Had you done a similar type of large scale project at Hasbro before you came to Care New England that kind of gave you a foundation for how to manage something that is that? I don't want to say it's disruptive. I guess maybe transformational is the word, but there's a lot of disruption at the front end of that transformation.
Sure. Fairly early in my career at Hasbro, maybe about 10 years in, I was assigned to an SAP ERP implementation. And that was our first implementation. And I was the full-time logistics resource assigned to that implementation. Then I'll say Hasbro did the right thing. They resourced it correctly. They took people out of the business. They backfilled the business where necessary. And they really staffed the project appropriately. It's not to say that everything was perfect as we went through the project. Every project has its challenges and its pitfalls, but at least from the upfront, it was staffed appropriately. Also, at Hasbro, I've been through transportation management implementations, and there have been some failed implementations too. And there was one which is a warehouse management system implementation very early on that comes to mind, but that could be a podcast in and of itself.
There's those times. So when you started that whole ERP implementation, I mean, were there times, were there red flags, were there problems that presented pretty early on?
Sure, because while I say that the project was resourced appropriately, it was when you think about the head count or the numbers of people, but not necessarily the correct people every time. Firstly, it was an IT driven project, and when it started, and their goal was to try to drive everything to standard functionality and come up with as vanilla as possible. So there was a particular resource on the sales side that really was not part of the mainstream business for a long enough period of time to understand it. And really was kind of going off the rails saying, well, yeah, we can use this base functionality. Again, the mantra that IT was pushing. But the reality was that if that base functionality had gone into place, it would have completely blown up our sales department's ability to allocate product across customers. So, me being there and having the relationship with the folks on the sales side, I was able to raise that red flag and go back to the business. I mean, we really almost paused the project at that time and assigned additional resources out of sales. And I eventually became the co-lead on sales, not just on logistics.
You're using the term sales differently than I'm used to. Explain that to me. That was
at Hasbro. And
that would be that was at Hasbro. Yeah. So when I talk about sales, it's really sales administration and customer service.
Oh, I got you. Okay.
All right, yeah. And that was all under the sales wing.
But I was going to draw the parallel, Hayes. So you're right where I'm going.
Well, I was just
if
small brain there.
Is sales is who's going to the Walmarts of the world, and you just said like customer service at Hasbro. Who sort of is that role in the healthcare organization? If you were to translate who you were watching for red flags that would have completely disrupted patient care, I'm assuming it's the clinician, but I kind of wonder, like, if you were to create that analogy, who would be sales in the healthcare organization?
Yeah, sales really wasn't the challenge in the healthcare organization, but it was the clinical side of the business. Because they have been, again, used to doing things the way they have done it for so long, and they're used to filling out their orders on their little paper forms, and they're used to faxing them over. And as a side note, I didn't even know people used fax machines anymore until I joined healthcare in 2014. So, but let me tell you what, there's sales going on in fax machines to this day. I will tell you that. But their resistance to using the new technology and learning the new technology was probably our greatest challenge, even to the point where the staff on the supply chain purchasing side, who for years, many 30, some folks there 30 years, have been working with these same people and processing their paper orders, continue to try to process paper orders after the system had come up. And, I had to sit down with my team and tell them, listen, here New England invested in this technology. We have an online requisitioning system. Your users are going to utilize that system. And if they don't, then they're not going to get their orders. And if you process another paper order, I'm going to fire you. And it literally had to come to that point for people to push back enough. And it was really challenging.
I've heard this with ERP implementations a lot, where, you have this opportunity to make a significant improvement in how you do business, make everybody's lives easier. But then, somebody starts to lead the project and they start recreating the current inefficient processes in the ERP. And so they're like asking the consultants to recreate those processes instead of the consultant guiding them through, well, here's the best practice, because this is how the ERP was built to address all the problems with what you're asking me to build back into the solution. Like, there's a reason it's not in the solution. It probably shouldn't be there. Did you find that too, or have you found that when you've done?
Oh, sure. Yeah. Sure. Found it on every implementation I've ever worked on. And, to me, there's two key factors on that. One factor is who the resources are that are assigned to work on the implementation, and are they forward thinking, and are they able to change their way of doing business and see the opportunity and see the efficiency. And the other is the leadership back in the business. They have to be willing to accept the change, and they have to be willing to understand that, okay, well, we're going to do things a little bit differently than we've done it in the past, but this is going to be better. It's going to be better for us. It's going to be better for our customers, internal, external.
So is the communication on the front end and then reinforcement of that, like, well, it's actually a two-part question. Is that critical? And is it achievable? Is it a realistic goal?
No, you can't communicate enough. And you're never going to get your message through to everybody. And even people that hear the message, some of them are not going to accept it. But you have to communicate before the project starts, all the way along through the project, and at conclusion, implementation, and even afterwards. Communication is critical to the success of any project.
Can you kind of describe the timeline roughly of when, were you there when they said this is the product we're going with, and then to implementation? Do you have idea what that was?
No, I joined about a year into their implementation.
Okay.
And I think they were either had just missed or were coming up on their first implementation date. So I reported to the COO of the organization at the time, and she assigned me to this project, and I was looking forward to it because, believe it or not, I enjoy doing these projects because I enjoy these implementations. So I got into the first meetings, and I started to look around and see what everybody was doing and understand where we were at. So I went back to my next one-on-one with the COO, and I told her, this thing's off the rails. And she looked at me and said, okay, now you have to get it back on the rails. And I was like, me? I just started here. But that was the assignment. And then we started that. And honestly, it took a while to get back on the rails, and it was not anything I could do alone. One of the biggest things that I noticed when I really started digging into the project is there was a tremendous lack of governance on the project. There was no senior executive steering committee that got weekly report outs. And even the weekly team meeting that happened, which was essentially the IT leaders and the project folks, CNE at the time had an interim CIO. Mondays were his travel day. Well, these meetings were held Monday morning, so he never joined a meeting. And that was kind of just the functionality or maybe dysfunctionality around that project. And even as we were going through just the basics of, everybody thinks process, right? Everybody thinks how the ERP and how it's going to run the business. I started asking questions about the technology that we're going to run it on, because CNE had very, very old technology, very, very old PCs, very, very old software on those PCs. Nobody from the technology side of IT had been in any of the meetings. So we didn't even know whether our PCs were going to be able to run the software.
Wow.
I would almost say that's insane that didn't come up, but I'm sure there were reasons.
No, it would have come up if they scheduled the meeting for Tuesday morning, right?
No,
but it's kind of like, that's kind of basics.
CNE had never done a project of this type before, and nobody understood or appreciated the magnitude of this project. And really, I also think that they didn't get great leadership and great guidance from the consultants. I'm not going to say which software firm it was, but the consultants were from the software firm, where what I've been kind of used to in the past is we've had a combination of consultants who are from the software firm and consultants from a third party. And the third party really drove the project management, making sure that all the resources and, they've got the project plan they're going down, and technology is certainly on the project plan along with all of the business processes.
That's an interesting best practice. And I want to kind of restate it back to you and see if I've captured it. Do you feel like the consultants from the software solution are experts on how to develop the software solution, how to configure it, like how to maneuver in that? And then the consultants that are from the third party are the ones that are, to your point, project managers, but also know, like, wait a second, there's something that this group just said that could really take this project down a dark, dark path. Whereas maybe the software solution engineers don't know that because they're just trying to help the customer achieve what they're asking for.
Yeah, I think that's the case. And I think really the third party is really kind of your partner as the client, really working with you to guide and to drive the software company. And I'm going to tell you, even in my experience with some of these software companies, is that the consultants that we had assigned to some of our engagements, the only implementations that they had done had been at the healthcare systems that they worked for, and they implemented that software and then were hired as a consultant. So they weren't even expert in the functionality of the system. All they knew was how they did it where they were. And that was the solution that they would try to push. And that was the process that they would try to push, was what they had implemented when they were clients. I've also had, I'll tell you, with Hasbro, with SAP, the SAP consultants, in my opinion, were probably the most knowledgeable consultants that I've worked with regarding the software applications and the capabilities of that software. So we could have a discussion, well, does it do this? Does it do that? Can I do this? Can I do that? And they knew the limits of the software, not what they had implemented where they used to work. And that was truly beneficial.
So, you were kind of talking about them not, maybe that everybody not understanding the magnitude of the project because they'd never done one that size before. What were some of the pitfalls that you were trying to avoid once you were sort of calling it out to them? Like, listen, this is a bigger project than you might realize. And here's what could happen to us if we don't recognize it. Or maybe even by the time you came in, there were already things that had happened that were unavoidable just because of how it was initiated and at the start.
Sure. This is the software system that they're running the business on, right? They're not running the clinical side, they're running the business side. And, one of the things that I think is underappreciated in a lot of healthcare systems is the business side. So you're not having a surgery done unless you've got the supplies there when you need it for that surgery. You don't have those supplies there unless the orders get put into the vendors, received into the supply chain, and delivered to the operating rooms. You don't have vendors shipping you unless you're processing invoices and paying vendors on time. Those were the kind of things that needed to happen and that were critical. If this system came up and we were not able to process orders, then we were not going to be able to care for our patients. We could try to do some things manually, but I'll tell you, we were a just-in-time inventory system. We did not carry a lot of, safety stock. We carried some safety stock on stat items, but we didn't have a warehouse that we could rely on for 30 days while we worked out the bugs of not being able to transmit orders. We needed to be able to transmit orders on day one. Similarly, we needed to be able to pay vendors so that they would continue to ship us.
Man, imagine that now. I mean, first off, we already know what an adjustment the pandemic was on folks who had just in time, set up. But even more so, think about everybody going on credit hold these days. If you had that delay in payment to your vendors, I mean, that, to your point, not having product would be, almost an epidemic of itself for the organization.
Yeah, I'm not going to tell you we didn't have delays in paying vendors.
We don't have to discuss that.
I'm not going to tell you what kind of delays that we had, but I think what made it tolerable is we had two things going for us. One is we communicated to the vendors. Everybody knew what was going on. Everybody knew that we were coming up. They knew that there was a potential for problems. We kept them updated and posted as to the progress on resolving these problems. But the other part of it, which I think is key, and not only to getting us through the go live, but even, you mentioned COVID. It's the key to getting us through COVID is, we built real partnerships with our vendors. This was not a one side, we're going to turn the screws on and we're going to get every last penny out of you. My approach and my team's approach was, we want a contract that is really good for the organization that we work for, but we also want one that the vendor is going to be happy with. And if the vendor's not happy with it, they're not going to service us. And they're not going to work with us when we need a favor from them or we need them to kind of help us through a tough situation like not being able to pay their invoices. So I really think it was the relationships and the partnerships that we built that got us over the hump there. And I will tell you, without a doubt in my mind, we made it through COVID because of the relationships that my team had with the vendors. And we never ran out of a single urgent supply or a single piece of PPE because we were able to get it with the folks that we had partnered with.
That's fantastic. So, Steve, like, you said earlier that you had that conversation with, I think, the COO, that it was off the rails. It was not going well, right? Which I love that.
Quote unquote. Yeah.
Quote unquote. So it was off the rails. So that executive says, it's yours. Take it over. Let's do something. And you said red flags everywhere. So can you give me like one or two, like what was those first 2 or 3 things you said I've got to do in order to get it back on the rails? And then how long does that process take?
I think the first things we had to do is really find out where we were. That was number one. I don't think we really truly understood where we were. And we had to dig into the project plan, dig into what the work was that really needed to be completed, and come up with realistic projections of, when is this going to get done? So I guess maybe for lack of any other description is to really fine tune and get a better project plan in place. The other was really to get into the business requirements and get an understanding of the business requirements, because I don't believe that they were ever really truly communicated. And I do believe some of the people that were making decisions on the business's behalf didn't understand how the business worked. And similar, I think that happens in almost every ERP implementation. So we almost had to go back to a process mapping and just very basic business requirements. I don't want to say starting over, because it wasn't starting over, but it was kind of pausing and getting our arms around where we were and then charting our path forward. And it took a while. So it was another year plus before we went live. I mean, even then, when we went live, we were not ready, but it was the right move. If we waited till we were ready, we never would have gone live, but we had to rip the Band-Aid and go for it.
One of the best practices that you kind of laid out there was communicating as things were arising with your vendor partners and letting them know, like, this is what's happening right now. Do you feel like, it seems like every time I'm talking to, health systems every week, and it seems like somebody's like, yeah, we're about to launch our new ERP. We're going through an ERP implementation. Like, it's rampant right now. And so I wonder, do you feel like the supplier partners are sensitive to that? And it really is just as simple as saying, listen, we're going to do this ERP implementation. We know that this is going to disrupt, the established processes. It could impact payment. Do you feel like they're sensitive to that in general? Like, because it's so common?
I think they're used to it. If that means sensitive to it or not, I'm not sure. But I think it all goes back to, again, the relationship and the partnership that you have with the vendor. And if you've been paying the vendor 90 days late, and you haven't been meeting your part of the bargain, they're not going to be as willing to help us out, cooperate, and be patient while we work through the problems as if we're paying on time, we're a good partner, we're communicating, and we didn't squeeze every last penny out of the deal from you.
Well, we talked through a number of best practices. You mentioned several, but I wonder, as we're kind of like coming to the end of the interview, like, are there a few like really key ones that either we didn't talk about or that we should emphasize just that much more before we wrap up? Like, hey, before you start on a big project like this, make sure you ABC.
Number one is make sure that your executive team, your senior leadership, understands the magnitude of this project or the project and is also committed to it. And as part of that is also setting up governance that includes senior representation from all the different areas of the organization, anybody that's touched or impacted, and even somebody that might think they're not impacted, they'll be impacted. If somebody is in marketing and then say, well, we just deal with marketing agencies, we don't issue purchase orders or we don't pay invoices. Well, you know what? You will be issuing purchase orders, and your vendors do get paid through invoices. So you need to have somebody, at the table as we're going through this and helping us communicate to your vendors. And I think the other is to really recognize the magnitude of the project. This is a major project that touches every aspect of your business. And the most important thing when you're thinking about an ERP is realizing that it's an integrated system. You can't skip a step at the front and expect the process to work at the back. I'll give you a great example. The purchasing folks used to get a call from a client on the clinical side and saying, hey, I know I put my order in, but I need you to add a box of gloves to it. So then they would simply call the vendor and say, hey, add a box of gloves to the order. Never update the purchase order. Invoice would come in. Invoices were manually paid and approved, so it was just signed off on. Well, they were doing that. They started doing that in the ERP. All of a sudden, every invoice kicked out. And again, had to sit down and have the same discussion. Next person that adds an order, adds a line to a purchase order that's already been issued, gets fired. And it really, I don't want to sound like a tyrant that I'm threatening to fire everybody, but it was literally that hard to make people change what they were doing, that without the threat of potentially losing their job, they weren't going to change. And that's, again, change management is a huge part of it, not just with the folks that I've talked about, but through the entire organization. Most places have done ERPs or multiple iterations of ERPs. So the change management is probably not as significant as it was 25 years ago. It's probably more nuanced, but it's still different. And people still have to do their jobs differently. So it's understanding and communicating out what that change really is. And then, the other thing is just as you're going through, we talked about don't recreate your existing processes. Always look for best practices where you can implement best practices, but don't also try to shoehorn them in. In some instances, that best practice is not going to fit how you do business because there might be something that's nuanced about it. Again, I'll go back to Hasbro for a minute. And Hasbro is a seasonal, fashion-driven promotional business. And what do you mean fashion? Well, toys come in and out as quickly as clothing comes in and out. And it was always compared to fashion. And the standard product allocation systems would not necessarily work there like they could for a very basic type product. And the last thing I would say is as you are, implementing these systems is making sure that you're not overcomplicating processes that you're looking to put in place. I've seen a couple of major implementations fail because somebody was really a visionary, had great ideas, but they tried to build this system to accommodate every scenario that could possibly happen, that 1 in a million. And if you build something that complicated, one thing I can guarantee you is it's not going to work.
Yeah, exactly.
And you talk about consultants too. So for like a really large project that you've never having somebody else involved, right? Like I kind of heard that as you really need a third party that can advocate for you in a big project like that.
A lot of, there's some very large organizations that maybe do these major implementations all the time, but we are a very small IDN in Providence, Rhode Island, 3 hospitals, not a huge IT staff, hadn't been through this. You really need somebody to advocate for you through the project. It is that third party that's going to advocate for you. It's what they do. They do these implementations. You don't do them day in and day out. They do them day in and day out. They know what to watch for. They know what it takes to make it successful.
It's so funny, anytime you hire somebody new to an organization, I'm just going to kind of make this analogy. It's like you can't give them the experience, right? Or maybe they're early in their career. They have to go out and have experience before they become proficient. And I think that's what you're alluding to is the consultants have regular experience over and over that they've become proficient. But, how many people would go down the road on a project like this and you have the conversation with them and they say, yeah, if I had known what I knew at the end of the project, this is what I would have done, or these are the decisions I would have made, on the front end. And truthfully, if you haven't gone through it, you don't know those pitfalls. And so I can really see the advantage in that.
No, I think you're dead on. When I joined Hasbro, early on in my career, I decided there were 3 things that I needed to do to be successful. One is I needed to learn how the entire business operated, not my little piece in the traffic department, which was loading trucks and shipping them out. No, I needed to know how everything worked upstream and downstream from me. 2 is I needed to learn and understand the systems that we did business on and the systems we used to run our business on. And 3, I needed to build a network within the organization of folks from other areas, other disciplines. And I did all that. None of that prepared me for an ERP implementation. I think I was as prepared as could be, but this was back, fairly early days, pre-2K, and everybody needed to get their ERP up. So it was a major initiative and we had never done it. But the experience that I picked up from that implementation the learnings that I put away from that implementation, from a subsequent implementation at Hasbro, a couple other large projects we did, and then the implementation at Kieran Nguyen, that I think have really, each point, you grow through your career and you learn these things and you become the expert and you become the resource. And again, I'm going to go back to that word that I keep using, is the advocate. I need that consultant who's my advocate, who's going to go back to the ERP groups of the world. Listen, you're blowing smoke here. We all know what you can do. We all know what you can't do. We all know what you need. We all know what you don't need. And, really, really work through it on the client's behalf.
All right, Steve. Well, I think you got people thinking, and I know there's a lot of ERP implementations. So there may be some folks that want to reach out to you and pick your brain. Exactly. How could they get a hold of you?
Well, the best way is going to be through my LinkedIn page. I don't even know how I give that to you guys now, or how that works.
People will look it right up. Steve Silva, right on. Okay. I'll spell it in case somebody's listening and doesn't have the write up right in front of them, but Silva, pretty much how it sounds. Just find Steve on LinkedIn and shoot him a LinkedIn message if you want to pick his brain a little bit further.
Yep, sounds good.
Steve, fantastic. It really was so interesting, even what you were saying about Hasbro, and just I love learning about how it operates and in other industries. But I never would have thought you'd compare the toy industry to the fashion industry, but it totally makes sense. It's got a lot of fad to it.
It absolutely does, and I'll tell you what, and especially more so nowadays than it ever was, because think about how many toys are tied to movies. And a movie release and a movie that comes and goes, right? And if you're not there, you don't have that product when it hits and when it's opening or pre-opening, and then have it for Christmas, you're stuck with that product. When it comes in late, you're in trouble. But, I've really enjoyed talking about this today. I really came into this kind of a little worried that what I was going to be talking about was going to be kind of so basic and kind of, Project 101, talking about ERP implementations. But I think sometimes it's really the basic stuff that gets you, right? And, it's the blocking and tackling, and it's everybody knows you need governance. Everybody knows you need to resource a project. Not everybody does it, though.
Well, clearly y'all didn't to start with. And so I think that's actually, words of wisdom for everybody that's listening. You got to do the basics, or the big stuff will never happen. Mm-hmm. Well said. Well done.
Yeah, great job, Steve. That was Steve Silva, supply chain expert and consultant, talking about systems integration and implementations. And I like how he wrapped it up there, Hayes. Some of this stuff is really very much the basics, but he put some stories in there. And at the same time, a lot of people missed a few things, or maybe they didn't put enough thought. Like maybe they have a governance structure, but they haven't really thought about how the governance is going to fit on the project exactly the right way. Because like he said, when he got ready to do that, he needed to learn how the business operated. So in one of his stories, it's like they sort of had the governance, but they didn't understand the business. So the decisions that were being made were not aligned properly, which also have, some consequences, into a big project like this. And, these could be multi-year endeavors and really take a lot of many people's time. So I really like what he said about making sure you've got like a consultant, a third party to help you go down that kind of a journey.
Of course. And like you said, sometimes it's a multi-year thing. It's a multi-million-dollar decision. And if you don't start out right, you get in a big bad situation. And to his point, sometimes you just got to put your fist down and say, if you don't do it the way this is happening, we're going to make changes. And so he did a really good job framing the whole thing up, I thought, and the basics matter. And I think he certainly made that point, and great interview.
Yep. Excellent. All right, everybody. On behalf of Hayes and Gary, where are you, Gary?
He's not here.
And myself, thanks for listening to this episode of
Power Supply.
Bam!
Thank you for listening to this week's episode of Power Supply. As a reminder, you can help support us by subscribing on your favorite podcast app or by downloading the smartphone app on your iPhone or Android. Simply search for Power Supply in the App Store or Google Play. The best thing about downloading the smartphone app is that you can access bonus content for certain episodes and view episodes in certain categories, like articles on the go and vendor spotlights. Are you following us on LinkedIn or Facebook yet? If you are and you love an episode or post, then let your social network know about it. Like, comment, or share our posts along with your thoughts and keep the conversation going. If you have any topics or guests that you would like to recommend for a future episode, just send us an email to info@powersupplymedia.net. We look forward to hearing from you.